Thanks for the introduction. That was perfect. So today we'll talk a little bit about a real-world use case, the conservation side that does leverage, cloud technology, a cloud foundation. And before I get into that, with regard to Vulcan, I think most of you know at least one of Vulcan's arms or businesses, whether it be real estate or investment and everything. But for me, I'm trying to focus a bit more here on not just the giant portfolio, but within Impact. There's a lot of conservation projects we do, in addition to the usual for-profit or more philanthropic side of things. It's a giant portfolio within a portfolio, if you will. And so one easy way to at least get a sampling, an appetizer of a lot of those conservation projects, at least most of them, we just have a little video here from our CEO, Bill Hilf. And I think it's a pretty good use of roughly 2 minutes of time to just blast through a lot of the current projects.
At Vulcan, when we approach a problem, we look for our unique way in. And that phrase, way in, comes from our founder, Paul Allen. And he inspires us to look for the unconventional path to take the best practices from modern businesses, particularly technology businesses, and apply those practices and methods directly to very complex and hard problems in our world. We're using emerging technology, data, and advancements in artificial intelligence, such as machine learning, to tackle some of the hardest problems in conservation. That's the grand experiment here, is can we bring together something truly unique and have impact on the world using the best practices from the most successful companies.
All right, so again, a pretty broad palette of different projects, mostly in the conservation space. I'm going to go dial it in here into the elephant side of things. And for us, as I talk about Earth Ranger, which is one of the products we're going to dive down to the decision-making process for, it did start with this census. And if you look at how this kind of comes about, any type of intervention that you want to bring into the domain, if you will, if you aren't able to establish some kind of baseline and kind of measure improvement, those interventions, if you will, they're going to be questionable at best, and it's just hard to kind of understand where things are headed. And on top of that, if you look at our founder, Paul, clearly had a love, a admiration, and certainly a long-term commitment towards helping elephants. And so these things actually, in a founder-led company, do represent some nice efficiencies in terms of making decisions, getting things done, and moving quickly there, of course, while doing all of your diligence and things of that nature. So for us, it did start with this census and this ability to kind of create that baseline. And one thing that is very eye-opening, at least for me when I first saw it, was the scale. The scale required, the number of moving parts you had to kind of coordinate and keep together just to get that first snapshot. The crew size, of course, is massive, but even if we look at the domain experts, the scientists involved across so many countries, it was a heavy lift. And I think despite this being a huge success at the time it was done, there's still ongoing movement to modernize a lot of the survey technology, even methodologies, if you will, to just get this, just more accurate. And in my opinion, the ones I look at very closely is having something that's a little bit more auditable in terms of if you have raw data, and you have to be sensitive to the politics, and this is data that sometimes has to be kept a little bit more private. But in general, if you did have the raw data around whatever imaging you're using via the classifiers and your detectors to actually count things, in the future, should there be an improvement or a question about results or things of that nature, it'd be nice to be able to refer back to a body of raw data that you can just present or produce. And so I think there's a lot of good movement in this area, and I look forward to seeing this develop. But this is the baseline as far as have something in place to measure where things are, and then of course as you move forward, have confidence that your interventions, whatever they may be, are working in the right direction. And so, speaking of interventions, the next question, in addition, what are we going to do? What are we going to do here? And, you could easily start with much higher economic policy type things, and we do a lot of that. I think our portfolio generally speaks for itself as far as the breadth of things that we do. But at a technology level, what we kind of came down to was, starting with that weigh-in that Bill brought up. This is a little bit oversimplified, but you can kind of think of three buckets, right? The first one is something we already do a lot of. You can just look for existing parties, existing entities, existing NGOs that are already doing really well in whatever domain you're trying to serve, and then fund them or support them, whatever be grants or whatever vehicle you're using. So that often, I think, is the default case as far as find the best in class, try to support those folks. And get a little more tactical. In this case, it was backed by user research or user feedback. Equip the frontline folks with better tools, empower them a lot more, the folks on the ground, frontline, doing the actual work. And then there's another one. We don't have a huge amount of precedent, but we do have precedent for this as far as, you've got to do your homework and diligence, but form a spin out of some kind, basically a spin out or a startup, 501c3, whatever the vehicle is, but have that spun out and focus on whatever that niche or that mission would be. And so, broadly speaking, 3 decision points to think about as we develop these programs. We went with building a tool. I mean, I think you can kind of predict, but this text here or this graphic here just represents some of the actual on-the-ground feedback as far as gathering of requirements and also leveraging long-term relationships with the actual frontline folks. This is one of the things, as an engineer, I've been very proud of. It's been a little bit different for me, given my background, my career. The number of folks with long-standing relationships with folks in the field actually doing the work, it's been great. I mean, normally for me, I'm used to being somewhat abstracted, with regard to a PM or some business development person that interfaces or acts as that interface or that voice of the customer, voice of the partner. But a lot of this work was in place as far as asking the end users what they would want, where the gaps are, and developing a requirements awareness. From there, once you've got your requirements document or your understanding, someone's going to have to build this. And I think even though it's presented as 2 options here, at the end of the day, for something like this, whether it be hardware, software, both, engineers are typically going to have to build something. And whether you do that in-house or outside, engineers will have to build something. And so for us, the build in-house aspect, there's a couple of factors there. The most obvious one for us initially was this idea that if you look at park capability, if you just kind of distill things down to that one dimension, in terms of parks that are very well equipped, in terms of their logistics, their network, their IT capability, training, things of that nature, and then you kind of have a spectrum where you go down to the other side where you're the opposite of that. Logistics are difficult, there was kind of a distribution, and it doesn't matter what these things are called as far as Seymour versus Smart, but at the very high end, you could see existing solutions that were, they were great, they were actually pretty good, but they were designed for parks with a very, very high capacity, and then kind of by extension, it was much smaller in number. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you have other systems, perhaps not real time, but much more broad-based, applicable, but perhaps not a complete solution, despite appealing to a very broad audience. And so for us, we looked at that need, that gap in the middle, and decided to build things in-house, given that identified need and some of the the capabilities and expertise that we have. From there, I think this is probably one of the ones that resonates most with this audience. You can think about, at least point in time, whether or not you should go proprietary or open source. And This is overloaded. I realize it's not this simple as far as a binary choice, especially if you look at the time as far as something maturing, an ecosystem maturing, a community expanding. But for us, initially, we went proprietary for all the usual reasons, right? If you don't have enough of an initial seed of a community or sustainability around protecting against downside, where both the developers and the actual customers get fragmented, get confused about what particular path or distribution to take, chaos ensues, and the project ultimately will probably fail or fall over on itself. And so for us, with the initial deployment, if you will, proprietary was the way we went, although I feel like open source is always going to be a consideration, especially if you are genuine about true sustainability, not just financial sustainability, but if there is enough of an ecosystem with enough stewards that are capable of taking this ecosystem, including the qualification of all those devices that are coming in, that's certainly a viable path. We have nothing we're trying to sell or an underlying technology we're trying to promote. We try to stay neutral on that. And on top of that, I think I alluded to this a little bit earlier, in terms of those parks and that capability, you could make a good argument for, hey, instead of locking down on a vertical on a solution, despite it coming from actual customers or partners, why not worry about infrastructure and kind of building infrastructure across all of those parks, or as many as possible, and so that they'd be more open to having, at least capabilities that are foundational capabilities that are robust and much more open to all kinds of solutions. I think that's a viable decision. We went with the customer features first, just because of that initial exercise around getting requirements and identifying gaps with the customers, the partners that we knew and had relationships with. So I think this could have gone either way, and they're both very worthy tranches to invest in. This is the one that gets the most controversy in terms of any type of solution that you deploy. The natural, intuitive answer is, of course you give it away. This is a philanthropic conservation effort. There's not like there's a lot of money or a huge market in this space, and of course you move it along. Maybe you offer some training and things of that nature. But one of the eye openers for me was tied to not just the one-sided market challenge, but without those relationships, especially from someone like me that does not initially have those relationships with the end users, there is this term, shelfware, basically, where it's difficult at times for certain entities to say no, in terms of there is an honest effort to try to help. If the requirements didn't quite nail it or the deliverable didn't quite nail it, that feedback, short of any kind of a genuine relationship, can get a little bit difficult or a little bit challenging. And so the charge aspect was just tied to trying to put a little bit more emphasis on, hey, this is going to start to align more with a more conventional business where the expectation, the bar, everything is higher. Expectations are there. There is no problem with pushing back just because it's no longer a charity or a donation that way. This table tries to represent some of those things as a spectrum in terms of the pure for-profit side, non-for-profit. And it is a bit distilled or simplified, but for us, we do give it away, but we have a close eye on this kind of dynamic, especially the shelfware kind of aspect, where intentions are good and you do your best to deliver a solution that meets the requirements. But as you know, things change, iterations have to take place before you can really dial in. For me, I rest almost all of it on maintaining strong relationships, engineering to basically end users, frontline folks, to try to get that channel of feedback around is this working versus not, versus purely using metrics, which we can do, obviously, to look at utilization around, the solution is never on, or it's on and no queries are happening. I feel like, for me, the relationships solve or address a lot of those challenges. And this is the kind of the final one. We went in with a certain partner, and I think if I look at a single project like Earth Ranger, of course you have to make a decision around which platform you want to go with, and that was great. Continues to work right now. But we have done a migration, and there's a lot of factors tied to that. For starters, across the portfolio, I don't want to be in a position where we are beholden or locked into a particular vendor. Sometimes that gets a little bit difficult, especially if the workflows. ML for me is the kind of the hot button, but if there's let's just say an ML workflow that happens to be a lot better today, for my developers, there's certainly influence in that area. But in general, across the portfolio, we go with all three, and there isn't a bias there outside of, unless you get a huge amount of CSR credits or something along those lines, they'll definitely steer us in that direction. But with Earth Ranger, we did port, but there's no rule around having to go with one provider versus another. Yeah, so I have the accept partner credits and migrate. So the result, after all this, simplified decision-making tree, reasonable size project, reasonable time frame too, a couple years. You've got Earth Ranger, and you saw a little bit in the video. I've got another video in here too, but you can think of this, and this is kind of a theme that cuts across a number of those clips you saw, where you have large geographies, and they could be oceans, maritime versus terrestrial, or like land. A large geography with some kind of critical asset sprinkled there, whether they be elephants, rhinos, corals, fish, whatever it may be. Certainly some type of element that is adversarial, as far as poachers, illegal fishermen, and then kind of the crux is limited good guy resources. So whether they be your patrol people or your rangers, limited folks to kind of cover this large area. And so over time, for starters, you want to at least be able to have a very efficient repository of all this sensor data that's coming in 24/7, effectively real time, and then be able to kind of build insights around how best to deploy those limited, those scarce resources that are trying to patrol. And of course, if you look down the roadmap as far as aspirationally, of course there's ambition to bring in, whether it be the game theory, the AI, some of these kind of predictive analytics, so that you can get route planning out of this type of data. Even though a lot of this data, it is quite confidential or sensitive. But of course, that's the direction we're headed in. And the military, have been doing this for a long time, so doesn't always fit here, but the capabilities are certainly believable. I think there's a little clip on Earth Ranger in action. We'll go with that. Oh, the stats. Another kind of slot here. I think the kilometers covered is conservative, but in general, most folks will kind of focus on the arrests. And I think that's great. For me, there's definitely pride in these types of stats. But at the same time, so I don't fall into my own hypocritical hole, I am very sensitive for attribution. If you look at the philanthropic domain in general, and conservation for sure, you don't want to swing too far where your technology play or solution is kind of positioned in a way where this is all us. Like, we are the ones that are responsible for 100% of that number. The attribution is certainly, the reality of that is it's certainly much more distributed in terms of, whether it be the sensors or the tips that come in. The tool is, I think, useful for sure, but you don't want to have the pendulum swing so far that you attribute the end of poaching or whatever the grand claim is to a single technology or a single movement or even a single process. It definitely is a long-standing kind of team effort that goes across, multiple domains. And so, again, proud of these type of stats. These are great, and we'll continue to look at these, but they are not the end-all, be-all. And so this is a little clip of Earth Ranger in action. Most of you are familiar with these basic map layers and this ability to cycle through gobs of data, whether it be the time slider, the heat maps, right? And then actually see some deployments in the field, right, where at these jocks able to get trained and utilize this capability. Right. I think this is an actual loop, so let me cut it off. Yeah. Okay, that's the short presentation. Are there any questions from the audience around? Go for it.
Hi there. I've been to Africa a couple times, done game drives. I was in one private reserve a couple years ago in South Africa.
Oh, yeah.
So thank you for that. I've been to Africa a couple of times on game drives, and there was one place in Kruger National Park, South Africa. There was a private game reserve, so they had their own anti-poaching troops. Kruger National Park had its own anti-poaching troops, and then the South African government had its own anti-poaching group. So they had 3 different anti-poaching organizations, mostly to watch each other, right? Because of
yes.
Anyway, so maybe you can comment on that and your tool.
We just have to build coalitions, right, in terms of coordinated efforts. I mean, ideally, it would be at least at the national level where a whole country can standardize behind something, and there isn't as much either overlap or the desire to have to, or the paranoia around having to patrol each other, because the corruption is certainly a real concern for sure, right? But at the end of the day, with regard to the population counts tied to a census or something, no matter what kind of corruption or shenanigans or things that you have, if you do have a baseline at a high enough frequency, I feel like some of that stuff can get sussed out. In terms of, this is all nice, these are all nice tools, but if the elephant population continues to decline, or even by region, something's not lining up or something's not working out. So there is a little bit of checks and balance there, in addition to some of the, I guess, the multiple groups that are trying to work together. But it does, we have great folks on the ground that are trying to do exactly that as far as eliminate the overlap and try to get a standardization of some kind, an ecosystem built up, where at least the tool is trusted as far as not being, tainted in any way. So, any other questions? Is that Jack? All right, I think we're good.
One quick one, Chris.
Yeah.
How are you using collaboration tools amongst your team in Seattle and integrating with, in this case, Africa? Can you talk a little bit about the communication flows?
Yeah, so for us, we don't quite have the development center there, which I think would represent the speed of light in terms of iteration velocity, as far as having truly customers, partners, testers, manufacturers, everyone like in the same darn place. We're not quite there yet. The software side isn't as bad as far as there's a lot of things you can do in terms of being able to host things remotely if you can get around the data provenance kind of question. But in general, it's just the usual things. And we have constant flights out there, trips out there. We have some on-the-ground staff. But in terms of the true development versus deployment side, it is a hot button of mine, especially for the more hardware-oriented projects. If you look at a drones project or something like that, where you have physical things that you have to ship out there. To me, that is brutal as far as if you're not, deploying there is one thing, that's fine, but if you're doing true development and your iteration velocity depends on having to turn something on that end from parts here or, for me, that's just not a good place to be. And so, we've had some ideas around how to accelerate those types of programs that are much more hardware-software mix versus pure software, right? On the software side, all the same communication tools, tracking tools, collaboration tools, whatever's out there, we'll use it. I feel like it hurts a lot more whenever you've got a very strong hardware component in terms of regulation, moving things out there. It's just brutal, right? So Earth Ranger is mostly exempt from that. Even the qualification of the sensors or camera traps or collars, a lot of that can be simulated here. And the environmental differences, while they do exist, aren't as drastic as something like like a UAV or a drone development program. Any other questions? Yeah. I have a mic.
So I'm curious about kind of what comes next. You've implemented this Earth Ranger, and then how do you, following that decision tree, how do you continue supporting?
That's a great question. That's perfect. So on the sustainability side, you would hope to think that, at a high level, if it ain't working, we should cut this out and spend the money elsewhere. And for us, the test or one of the tests is that adoption side of things plus the community. If you have a number of vendors that do, camera traps is the easiest one to pick on just because this is not their main draw of revenue. If you've got a bunch of sensor manufacturers or sensor people adopting your API and being compliant with regard to your system, that's a good sign. Of course, the number of parks you have, the number of deployments that you have, that's another great sign. You've got to kind of push hard. The metrics for me are actually another hot button for me. They're difficult. They're difficult to do in a genuine way versus kind of the more vanity-oriented type of metrics. But if you can kind of quantify some of those things as far as the number of sensors and the number of parks and the kind of results that you're seeing, like in that snapshot, that could be a good way to kind of continue funding, if you want to call it that. Although ideally, this is super aspirational, but ideally it'd be great if a Vulcan or whoever comes up with this technology could literally just step away, step out, and have the community itself, including the fundraising needed to just do it yourself, right? Including, there's maintenance side for sure, but next generation development, ongoing qualification of hardware sensors. It'd be great to have all of that stuff much more truly sustainable in terms of on the ground, local resources funding that versus having to always depend on this kind of funder dynamic, right? Which can get a little bit tricky, right? So that's as honest an answer as I can give.
I actually have a question now too.
Yeah.
So Vulcan does cool stuff. You've counted sharks
Yeah.
in the sea. You're stopping poachers from poaching all of these animals. What are other projects that would be useful using technology like this or using that?
Yeah, so if you look at, there's a little bit of a clip on there. Even though it's tagged as an illegal fishing project, if you do have maritime capability where you can monitor the seas for illegal fishing, basically any type of illegal activity, well, I should say any kind, but you can monitor the oceans for just illicit behavior. You can use your imagination and think about how that can cross over easily into non-philanthropic or basically for-profit type ventures. For us, the initial use case is illegal fishing in terms of being able to, I mean, it's a big industry. It's not going away. It's very difficult to police. We have satellite capability, plus there's definitely some ML involved in that too, where over time, as you train these data sets, and they're not as easy as the typical classifiers and detectors, you start to figure out that, predictively, that something bad's about to go down or something bad has gone down. And, you can lead that to hopefully some type of intervention around, stop doing that, especially for countries that have a difficult time for that very reason. They might have humongous exposure via their oceans, and it's not two patrol ships, whatever it is, right? You're going to be very hard pressed to police your waters, right? So the legal fishing, the Skylight project is one of those. And of course, if you look at, I talk about sensors, like they are everywhere. Satellite and multispectral down to, for us, the drones. We've had to develop our own drones just because you look at military level capabilities, which are great. The military stuff is actually almost perfect, except for the price. So between military and maybe high-end, DJI type stuff, there's a huge gap in the middle around platforms that can hold sensors. So they're not for delivery, no logistics play here, but basically aerial kind of platforms that involve taking a person out of a risky situation where you can kind of patrol areas using the same type of things, EO, IR, whatever, maybe SAR to some degree, being able to get all that data collected. It's just basically a sensor play, right? So we do some development in that area as well. Always try to stay on top of what the latest is and how reliable it is, right? And then keep on building those data sets out. Any other questions? All right, I think we're just on time here, so thank you very much.
Great. Great. Thank you, Chris. Thanks, Chris. Really interesting stuff where you see the combination of the cloud and AI, ML, really meeting a real world problem that we see. And so thanks to Chris and the team at Vulcan for shedding some light on that.